3 months ago, my husband left me for my rich friend. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never recover from the betrayal. I thought that was the end of my story. But then one morning, a stranger appeared at my door. She said her name was Elora, and in her trembling hands, she held something that would change everything about the way I understood my husband, my marriage, and the people I called my closest friends. What happened next would spiral into a nightmare so twisted, so carefully constructed, that I still struggle to believe it was real. But before we dive deeper into this story, if you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to all of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 48 years old, and I live just outside Portland, Oregon. For the past 23 years, I was married to David Mitchell, a man I met in college who swept me off my feet with promises of adventure, stability, and a life built together. David was charming, attentive, and everything I thought I wanted. We built the life on a quiet street lined with oak trees. We had 2 beautiful kids, Emma and Jack, who are now in their early 20s. We had a house we loved, a mortgage we could manage, and what I believed was a partnership rooted in trust and commitment. But looking back now, I realize I was blind to so many warning signs. David had always been secretive about his phone, always taking calls in the other room, always claiming he needed privacy for work matters. I attributed it to stress. I thought he was just trying to shield me from business problems. How foolish I was. The affair with Jennifer Hartwell began roughly 18 months before David actually left me. I didn't know it was happening at the time, of course. Jennifer is the wife of Robert Hartwell, a venture capitalist with connections throughout the Pacific Northwest. They live in Lake Oswego, in one of those sprawling estates with a tennis court and a heated pool. Jennifer and I met through a charity committee. I was volunteering to organize a fundraiser for local schools, and she had been asked to join as a committee member. She was stunning, I'll admit that immediately. She had that kind of effortless beauty that comes from money, from personal trainers and dermatologists, and the freedom to prioritize appearance above all else. She wore designer clothes casually, never seeming to think twice about spending what I earned in a month on a single handbag. I didn't hate her at first. In fact, I thought we could be friends. We had lunch a few times. We texted about event planning details, and she even invited me to her home for coffee. I felt flattered by the attention. Here was this glamorous woman, and she seemed genuinely interested in spending time with me. I was stupid enough to think that meant something. I was stupid enough to introduce her to David at a fundraiser gala in the spring of that first year. I remember exactly what happened that night. David looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. It was just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. I saw hunger in his eyes. I asked him about it later, and he laughed it off, said I was being paranoid, said he was just being polite. I wanted to believe him. So I did. The second year of their affair was the year I started noticing real changes in David. He was distant. He was working longer hours, he said, at a new venture he was developing. He was staying late at the office, sometimes not coming home until after I'd gone to bed. He was showering immediately when he got home, and his phone was always in his hand, always buzzing with messages he never let me see. When I asked him about it, he became defensive. He told me I was controlling, that I didn't trust him, that my suspicions were destroying our marriage. And I believed him. I actually believed that I was the problem. I started questioning myself. Started thinking that maybe I was being unreasonable, maybe I was being too clingy or too needy or too paranoid. That's what emotional abuse does to you. It makes you doubt your own instincts. It makes you question your own perception of reality. It makes you complicit in your own destruction. The discovery happened on a Tuesday in March. David had left his laptop open on our kitchen counter while he went to take a shower. His calendar was visible on the screen. I wasn't snooping, not really. My eye just caught his name and Jennifer's name, scheduled together in a hotel room, marked with a heart emoji. Tuesday, 2 p.m., the Riverside Hotel, room 407. The calendar entry was dated for the following week. I remember staring at that screen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurring. I felt like I was going to be sick. I took a screenshot with my phone, and then I closed the laptop, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I waited for my world to fully collapse. When David came downstairs, I didn't confront him immediately. I told him I was tired, that I was going to bed early. He seemed relieved by that. He settled onto the couch with his laptop and his phone, probably messaging with Jennifer, probably making plans for their next encounter. I lay in bed that night, and I cried so hard I thought my chest would split open. I cried for the marriage I thought I had. I cried for the man I thought he was. I cried for the 23 years of my life that suddenly felt like a lie. The next morning, I confronted him. I showed him the screenshot. I asked him to explain. David's response was immediate and brutal. He told me he didn't love me anymore. He told me he hadn't loved me in years. He told me that the only reason he'd stayed as long as he had was for the children, but they were old enough now that he didn't have to pretend anymore. He told me that Jennifer understood him in ways I never could. He told me that she made him feel alive. And then he told me he wanted a divorce. He packed a bag that afternoon and moved into a hotel. He told me he'd be in touch through a lawyer. That was March 15th. For the next 2 weeks, I existed in a state of shock. I moved through my days like a ghost. I called in sick to work. I barely ate. I couldn't sleep. My kids came home for spring break, and I had to tell them that their father had left. That was one of the hardest conversations of my life. Emma cried. Jack was angry. They both asked me why, and I didn't know what to tell them except the truth. I was so angry at David for putting them through this pain. I was so angry at myself for missing the signs, for not seeing what was happening right in front of me, for being so easily deceived. 2 weeks into the separation, David retained a lawyer. The divorce proceedings began. His lawyer was aggressive and well-funded, which meant David was getting financial support from somewhere. I later learned it was from Jennifer, who apparently felt some combination of guilt and investment in David's future. My own lawyer was competent, but overworked. I knew I was going to lose in this situation. I knew that David was going to walk away with more than he deserved, that Jennifer was going to help him build a new life, and that I was going to be left picking up the pieces. I was prepared for that outcome. I was not prepared for what happened next. On a Friday morning in early April, I heard a knock at my door. I was still in my bathrobe. I had barely left the house in weeks. I opened the door to find a woman I'd never seen before. She was in her early 50s, with red hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent green eyes that seemed to look right through me. She was holding a leather folder close to her chest like it was a lifeline. She introduced herself as Alora Chen, and she said she was Robert Hartwell's wife. She asked if she could come inside. I was confused. I didn't know Jennifer's husband very well. We'd been at a few social events together, but we'd never spoken at length. I didn't understand why he would send his wife to see me, but something in Alora's expression told me that this was important. I let her inside. She sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd seen the calendar evidence of David's infidelity. She opened her leather folder and slid a stack of documents across the table. She began to speak, and everything I thought I understood about my situation changed completely. Alora told me that she'd been suspicious of her husband's behavior for a while. He'd been secretive, spending money erratically, taking trips he couldn't quite explain. She hired a private investigator to find out what was happening. What she discovered was so much more complicated and so much more sinister than a simple affair. Robert wasn't just having an affair with my husband. Robert was running an elaborate fraud scheme, and my husband and Jennifer were both part of it. The scheme worked like this. Robert would identify wealthy women, typically divorced or widowed, women with access to significant assets and a vulnerability that made them targets. He would introduce them to a carefully crafted persona. Sometimes he was a successful real estate developer. Sometimes he was a venture capitalist with inside stock tips. Sometimes he was a philanthropist looking for investment partners. He would seduce these women, win their trust, and eventually convince them to invest in his schemes. The women would lose hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes more than $1 million. By the time they realized what was happening, Robert had already moved on to his next victim. My husband David was Robert's partner in this scheme. He targeted women who were either separated from their partners or in vulnerable marriages. He would befriend them, seduce them, and introduce them to Robert. Once Robert had established himself in their lives, David would exit. The women would transfer money to Robert's various shell companies and fake investment vehicles, believing they were funding legitimate business opportunities. Some of the schemes involved fake real estate developments. Others involved non-profit organizations with charitable purposes that never actually existed. Still others were elaborate stock tip schemes with false documentation and fabricated returns. All of them were designed to steal money from vulnerable people. Alora had documentation of at least 8 different victims over a period of 7 years. Her private investigator had traced the money through multiple accounts, multiple jurisdictions, and multiple aliases. Some of the victims had already discovered they were being scammed. They had reported Robert to the police, to the FBI, to financial regulatory agencies. But because the schemes were so sophisticated and the money trails so deliberately obscured, prosecution had been difficult. Alora showed me photographs of the 8 victims. They were all similar in profile: women aged 45 to 60, women with access to money, women who had experienced some kind of significant life trauma or transition that made them vulnerable to manipulation. I could have been on that list. In fact, I should have been on that list. The only reason I wasn't was that David hadn't managed to introduce me to Robert before he decided to publicly leave our marriage. The timing had been off. David had been planning to establish Robert as a business associate, someone who could help David start a new venture after the divorce was finalized. That was going to be his entrance into my trust. He was going to exploit my vulnerability as a woman going through a difficult separation to manipulate me into transferring assets to Robert's fake investment schemes. But Jennifer had accelerated the timeline by pushing David to leave me and move in with her. She wanted him out of his marriage and available to her publicly. In doing so, she'd actually protected me without realizing it. I sat there at my kitchen table, holding these documents, and I felt a strange mixture of emotions. I was grateful that I hadn't been victimized further. I was horrified that the man I'd been married to for 23 years was capable of such deliberate cruelty and deception. I was devastated for the women who had been victimized. And I was furious that this entire scheme might go unpunished if we didn't act immediately. Alora explained why she'd come to me. She said she had already gathered all of this information and had already reported it to law enforcement. But she said she needed victims to come forward and corroborate the evidence. She needed their testimonies. She needed them to press charges. She said she couldn't do this alone, that Robert had lawyers who were very good at their jobs and very good at finding ways to make evidence disappear. She said she needed an army of people who had been wronged, people who had nothing left to lose, people who could help her bring down a predator. She asked me if I would help her. I said yes immediately. I didn't need to think about it. I didn't need to consult with anyone. I knew what David and Robert had tried to do. I knew they'd victimized women who'd done nothing to deserve it. I knew that justice required action. Over the next month, Alora and I worked together to contact the other victims. Some of them were reluctant to come forward. They were embarrassed about having been deceived. They were worried about their reputations. They were afraid of facing their families and friends and admitting they'd made such a catastrophic financial mistake. But gradually, most of them agreed to cooperate. We coordinated with the FBI field office in Portland. We provided copies of all the documentation that Alora had compiled. We helped the victims understand their legal options. 2 of the victims decided to press formal charges against both Robert and David. The investigation took months. The FBI had to trace the money through multiple accounts, multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries in some cases. They had to interview witnesses. They had to examine documentation. They had to build a case that would hold up in court. All the while, David and Robert maintained their innocence. They had expensive lawyers who filed motions to suppress evidence, who argued that their clients' rights were being violated, who claimed that this was all a misunderstanding born from personal revenge rather than actual crime. But eventually, the weight of the evidence became overwhelming. In January of the following year, both David and Robert were arrested and charged with wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft. Jennifer was also arrested and charged as an accessory, though the charges against her were eventually reduced because she could argue that she'd been deceived by Robert in the same way the other victims had been. The trial took place over the course of 6 weeks. I attended every single day. I sat in that courtroom, and I listened to expert witnesses explain how the money had been moved, how the shell companies had been created, how the false documentation had been fabricated. I listened to the victims give testimony about how they'd felt when they realized they'd been scammed, about the financial devastation, about the emotional trauma. I listened to David's lawyer argue that my husband had been a dupe himself, that he'd been manipulated by Robert just like everyone else. That argument didn't hold. The evidence was clear. David had made conscious choices to participate in this scheme. He had deliberately targeted vulnerable women. He had deliberately deceived me about his intentions. He was guilty. The verdict came on a cold February morning. David was found guilty on all counts. Robert was found guilty on all counts. Both men were sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Jennifer received 5 years with a possibility of early release due to her cooperation with prosecutors. As I sat there and listened to those sentences being handed down, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't happiness. It was something closer to completion. Justice had been served, not perfectly, but substantially. The men who had preyed on vulnerable people had been held accountable. The system, despite its flaws, had worked. In the aftermath of the trial, my life slowly began to reconstruct itself. The divorce proceedings accelerated, now that David had been convicted of fraud. My lawyer was able to negotiate much more favorable terms for me given the criminal nature of David's conduct. I retained the house. I kept most of our assets. I received alimony that would help me get back on my feet. The women who'd been victimized by Robert began to recover their money, though it took years and multiple legal proceedings. Some of them received full compensation. Others received partial reimbursement. None of them would ever fully recover the money they'd lost, but at least they recovered something. Alora Chun became one of my closest friends. We bonded over the experience of having been deceived by men we'd trusted, over the process of seeking justice, over the long journey back to wholeness. She helped me process my anger and my grief. I helped her process her own feelings about her marriage to Robert. We both came to understand that we'd been victimized, but that we'd also been empowered by our choice to fight back, to seek justice, to ensure that the predators in our lives faced consequences for their actions. My children struggled for a while with the knowledge of what their father had done. Jack was angry for years. Emma was hurt and confused. But eventually, they came to understand that this wasn't a reflection on them, that their father's choices were his own, that they could define themselves separately from his actions. Emma has gone on to become a financial advisor. Jack has become a defense attorney. Both of them, in their own ways, have channeled their experience with their father's crimes into meaningful work that helps people. I returned to work about 4 months after David's arrest. I eventually moved into a supervisory role at my firm. I rebuilt my finances. I traveled. I learned to be alone without feeling lonely. I learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving something terrible. It was about choosing to grow from it, choosing to help others, choosing to tell your story so that others wouldn't have to experience the same devastation. The lesson I learned from all of this is that predators are rarely operating in isolation. They operate within networks, within systems that enable them, within structures that protect them. Breaking those systems requires people who are willing to stand up and say, "What happened to me was wrong, and I'm not going to let it happen to anyone else." It requires collaboration and courage, and a willingness to face your own complicity in your victimization. I'm not saying this to blame victims. I'm saying this because I'm a victim too, and I know how easy it is to blame yourself, how easy it is to think that somehow you should have known better or done better. But the truth is that predators are experts in deception. They study their victims. They know exactly what to say to make themselves seem trustworthy. The fact that we believed them doesn't mean we were stupid. It means they were skilled. He was always making me feel like I was the problem in our marriage, like my suspicions were unreasonable and my emotions were overreactions. These are textbook tactics of emotional manipulation and abuse. I wasn't aware of them at the time because I didn't have the language or the framework to understand what was happening. But now that I've lived through it, I recognize them immediately. I see them in the stories other people tell me about their relationships. I hear the same patterns of doubt and self-blame and confusion that I experienced. And I try to help them understand that what they're experiencing isn't their fault, that they deserve better, that there is a path back to wholeness and healing. This is why I tell the story. This is why I'm asking you to subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. This is why I believe it's important that we hear from people who have survived betrayal and fraud and emotional manipulation. These stories matter not because they're entertaining, though they can be, but because they help people recognize patterns in their own lives. They help people understand that they're not alone. They help people find the courage to stand up for themselves and for others who have been similarly victimized. My mother, who didn't believe I could build an audience by telling these stories, has since apologized for her doubt. She's listened to the feedback I receive from people who've watched my videos and felt less alone in their own experiences. She's seen the messages from women who recognized their own situations in my story and found the strength to leave relationships that were harming them. She's understood that there is real value in speaking truth, in refusing to be silent about injustice, in using our pain to help others navigate their own darkness. So if you're listening right now, and this story has resonated with you, please consider subscribing to this channel. Help me continue telling these stories. Help me prove that narratives of survival and justice matter. Help me build a community where people who have been betrayed and broken can find healing and hope. Like this video if it spoke to you. Leave a comment with your thoughts or your own experiences if you feel comfortable sharing. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And most importantly, remember that no matter what you've been through, no matter who has hurt you or betrayed you, your story matters and you deserve to be heard. What do you think happened next in my relationship with Alora after the trial ended? Could you have done what I did if you found yourself in my situation? These are the questions I leave you with today. But if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when David tried to appeal his conviction and what we discovered about Robert's connections to other fraud rings across multiple states. That's a story for another day, but I hope you'll be here to hear it. Subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories and join us on this journey of justice, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. Thank you for listening.